Hello there, it's 6 o'clock. I'm Michelle Dewberry and this is Dewbs Co, the show where we'll get into some of the things that have got you talking today. And of course, the war in Ukraine very sadly continues. We'll be discussing the latest on that. I also want to look at the calls to boycott Western brands that haven't boycotted Russian markets. What do you think to that? And Putin has taken to the stage in Moscow. Got me thinking, how is all of this seen from the other side? And today, all remaining COVID travel restrictions have been lifted for passengers entering the UK. Are you someone like me that goes, yes, almost the end of COVID? Or are you the other side of the fence that goes, whoa there, cases are rising, hold on just a nanosecond? And have you been stuck waiting for your driving licence? If so, you won't like the news today of what's been happening within the DVLA. And I'm going to leave you tonight with some good news, a happy story. I've got to say, that seems all too rare at the moment, doesn't it? We'll have all of that to come, but first, the latest news headlines. Thanks for that. Well, keeping me company until 7 o'clock tonight, my panel, Daniel Moylan, who's the former advisor to Boris Johnson and now Conservative life peer in the House of Lords. We've also got Nabila Ramdani, who's a journalist and broadcaster, and Frank Furedi, author and academic. And you know the drill on Dewbs Co. It's not just about us here, it's about you at home as well and your thoughts. You can get in touch with me on email, gbviews@gbnews.uk, and you can tweet me at Michelle Dewbs or at gbnews. Don't forget, of course, if you haven't already, you can subscribe to us on YouTube. Watch all the best bits. When I say best bits, obviously, I mean Dewbs Co. You can search GB News, it's all on there, and you can watch us live. You might be doing that, and if you are, hello to you. And I always forget to mention, by the way, the radio. You can watch us, listen to us, on the radio. So if you're sitting there thinking, I want to watch Dewbs Co, but I need to go pick the kids up, worry not. You can listen to us in your car on DAB+. We are everywhere. So let's get into our first top story, shall we? It's day 23 of the war in Ukraine. And despite the talk of peace deals and demands, I've got to say, bombardment has continued across the country. Today, several cruise missiles struck and destroyed an aircraft repair plant near the airport in Lyiv. And to the south of the country, Russia's defense ministry said its forces were tightening a noose around the city of Mariupol. Frank Furedi, I'm going to pick up with you. This is never ending. Every single day you switch on the telly, you pick up a newspaper, and there's just more and more reports of devastation. We were speaking yesterday about are we potentially moving towards a peace process? What's your thoughts on all of this?
Well, I don't think the war is going to end anytime soon. It's evident that the resistance to the Russian invasion is quite formidable, quite exemplary. But nevertheless, the Russian military power is so overwhelming that despite the resistance and despite getting all these wonderful ground-to-air missiles which have been shooting down Russian airplanes, I think that it's likely that Russia will escalate. The bombing near Lyiv is a sign of a new sort of battleground being opened up. And I think that what we got to really worry about is that alongside the military escalation, there are a number of other dangerous developments. I think the principal dangerous development has been the way in which China and Russia have been pushed together so that their alliance, which has always existed informally, is becoming more and more formal and is becoming more and more dangerous in many ways. And I was a bit worried and sad when I heard President Biden lecture the Chinese as if they were young children about democracy. And predictably, the Chinese reacted by sending their aircraft carrier into the Taiwan Straits, giving essentially two fingers to Biden, but also indicating that their formal neutrality towards Russia is in practice going to be called into question. And I was talking to somebody this morning who knows a lot about Chinese affairs, and she was telling me that it appears that the Chinese are now supplying Russia with weapons on a fairly large scale, kind of covertly. So as long as that continues, there's a danger that the escalation is going to be are problem for the next, at least for the medium term, never mind the short term.
Yeah, and I think you're right with what you pick up there, Frank, as well, about the whole, I speak often, I'm like a stuck record sometimes on this programme about unintended consequences. Everyone's got the same intentions, which is, this needs to end as quickly as with as minimal impact on civilians as possible. And I understand the drive with the economic sanctions and things like that, but there are vast unintended consequences, and pushing people into China is just one of them. Nabila, your thoughts?
Well, when we see the footage of what's going on the ground, I think the expression total war comes to mind, and it describes an aggressor trying to win by any means possible. And I think that's what Vladimir Putin is definitely trying to do. And there's no question of limited attacks on limited objectives. Clearly, the Russian army has been told to focus on civilian targets as well as military targets, and the result is absolute hell. And I think the Russians clearly don't want anybody to feel safe, and they attempt to make the Ukrainian government capitulate as soon as possible. And we've seen Putin speaking on stage today in Moscow in front of a massive crowd, and he very much has the look of an old-style dictator in charge of one of the largest military forces in the world. And I think, as Frank was saying, we cannot underestimate the absolute military might of the Russians. Putin is speaking very much in dramatic and often irrational language, which is full of references to the Great Patriotic War against the Nazis, and indeed references to the Cold War. And we should not forget that he has a massive stockpile of nuclear weapons as well as chemical weapons, and that is what makes his speech particularly terrifying. And I think that too many commentators are underplaying Putin's power and indeed capability. We're ultimately dealing with a country that is almost twice the size of the USA, and it has a massive military complex and is very tightly controlled. And in comparison, the Ukraine is just a little bit smaller than Texas. Now, these are just the cold facts. It's not an opinion about how this war might develop.
Yeah, and I think you're quite right in terms of population, landmass and stuff. Russia is vast, but in terms of like GDP, economic size, I think it's something like the 11th economy in the world. And France, Italy, also, lots of economies actually are much bigger than Russia. And I think this is surprising to a lot of people, Daniel, because we do talk about, economic sanctions and people. I think maybe it's a hangover from the USSR days. People have this vision that the Russian economy is vast and mighty, and actually it's not as big as people might think it is.
No, it's a very small economy, and if it didn't have oil and gas and natural resources to export, it would be a really insignificant economic player, but it's a big military player. But I'm a little bit more optimistic than Nabila and even Frank, because the fact is the Russian troops have been making almost no progress. And in military terms, they've achieved very little over the last few weeks. What they've managed to do is a lot of destruction. So take the bombings now that are going on in Lyiv. That's way out in the west of the country. They have, as far as I know, no troop formations there at all. This is purely flying in planes to bomb the place for destructive purposes, not to support a military occupation, not to advance their troops. Their troops are stuck in the mud. And I think they're going to run out of steam at some stage. And there's a lot of hope given to the Ukrainians that if they hold out, they can actually reach a stalemate with the Russians. And so I don't think their military power is actually serving them as strongly as you might think.
I would qualify that, because that's exactly what Russia did against the Russians during against the Germans, during the Second World War, before throwing their vast manpower and indeed industrial might at the war, winning comprehensively. And that's exactly what Stalin did. Soviet casualties far outnumbered any other countries in the Second World War. And there's every indication that Putin will just keep throwing soldiers and armament at what he views as a just war.
Yeah, but you can't really compare this war to the Great Patriotic War.
Oh, no, in terms of tactics, that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah, but I think the tactics are fairly interesting, because the reason why they bombed Lviv is to send a message to Poland and to NATO.
Yeah.
That was a very very clear message. At the same time, I think the truth is halfway in between. They are very powerful. But also what's interesting is that they haven't really begun to use their massive air superiority. I mean, people talk about total warfare, but at the moment, they really held back from serious saturation bombing, the kind of things that they've been capable of and they've done in Grozny and other kind of places in the past. So I think it's too soon yet because Russia's might has not been unleashed totally. But I think at the same time, what Daniel says about the resistance and the way in which that has messed up the initial plan are really quite important. But that's why I think it's important to realize we're in a very, potentially very early stage of this conflict.
And what about, I mean, we're talking a lot about military conflict, war on the ground, in the air, etc. But I think that one of the things that's very tricky at the moment is often knowing what to believe. So all of the information wars at the moment, there's so much stuff that's, especially in the world of social media, stuff just gets shared around instantly, and then actually it transpires that it wasn't true after all. So I wonder, Daniel, your thoughts just around the whole kind of information flow. I mean, the bulletin reader there was just mentioning about Russia Today, for example, has lost its license here. Do you think, in terms of information, how important do you think it is, I guess is my direct question, to know and to hear the other side of this debate? Because we hear a lot, we see a lot, we listen to Zelensky's address, etc. But understanding the other side of all of this, the Russian perspective, do you think that's important, of interest, or should just be ignored?
Well, I wouldn't have taken away the license of RT because I'm not frightened of propaganda. I don't think the British people are easily fooled by propaganda, and I'd have left Russia Today broadcasting personally. I don't think that would have done anything to sap morale or increase disinformation. The fact of the matter is the story is very stark. You have a country which appears to be a relatively democratic country being invaded by a country next door on very flimsy grounds, on the claim that it's not democratic, it's all run by Nazis, and it's got to be denazified, and it simply belongs, and it doesn't exist, it isn't a real country. So there is a very strong black and white to this. Mm-hmm. Do you want to understand how the Russians see it? Yeah, of course you want to understand how the Russians see it, because understanding how the Russians see it is necessary to see some way, if there is some way out of this. But that doesn't mean to say you accept that how the Russians see it actually has any great validity.
There's a grey area.
I was just about to say it, Daniel, you said there it's very black and white, but I actually feel that it's not always clear black and white. I think that there are nuance, there's context, there's history, there's shades of grey, and I think often that is ignored and dismissed at the moment. Frank?
Yeah, I mean, I think one area where, for example, we are not told the truth is in relation to the way that the sanction is working. So, for example, most people don't realize that the other day the American Treasury actually saved Russia from defaulting on its debts, on its bonds, because it pragmatically decided that it's far better for the American and the global economy if it does that. We don't often know that some countries in Europe, principally Germany, are playing a double game here in terms of being all talk about sanctions, but at the same time allowing gas and other raw material kind of sort of imports to kind of continue. So there is a kind of cynical pragmatism on our side, which I think needs to be discussed and debated, because at the moment we could be very naive about the meaning of the sanction, how that works. And I am worried that at the moment we're also doing something that I find reprehensible in this country, which we're arguing that academics who question the official version of events ought to be disciplined by their universities, which goes against the whole spirit of academic freedom and free speech. And sometimes we do really stupid, silly things like banning Russian tennis players from competing on the grounds that they refuse to put their hand on the Bible and say that they hate Putin. I mean, those kind of tactics are worthy of the other side rather than of our side. I mean,
but you raise a really interesting point here, Frank. It's not just tennis players. There's this absolute sentiment, and it's almost, I feel a little bit like compelled speech. And I almost feel, I'll be completely honest here, I feel like I'm really treading on eggshells and really being careful of my words so as to not cause offence or upset. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make is there's almost like become this, Ukraine and Ukrainian people good Russia and Russian people bad. It's kind of expanded into things, goods, services, etc. And I just kind of, it makes me a little bit nervous because every sane person would think that this kind of what's happening in Ukraine at the moment is wrong. Every sane person would want this to be, you know, finished as soon as possible, etc. But I just kind of, I'm trying to pick my words.
But I think, you know, propaganda has always been part and parcel of wars. That's why you have Ministry of Information and indeed
I'm not talking about propaganda. I'm talking about there's this whole kind of, you're seeing it right across society now. I'll give you an example today. Boycott Burger King, for example, is trending all over social media. And what it's all about is what people are saying is that Western brands must not operate in the Russian market. So your everyday Russian
Yeah, but what's
citizen.
wrong with boycotts? I mean, there's a big difference between bans and boycotts.
Absolutely.
Okay? I personally might choose to boycott Burger King for just that reason. That's my personal choice. That's my autonomy. Nobody should be able to tell me about that. That's very different from a ban. And it is true that an awful lot of people feel revulsion at things that are connected with Russia or things that endorse the Russian government at the moment, and they should be free to undertake boicots. I wouldn't object to that at all. And there is a difference between that and banning, and I worry about Frank and the academic clampdown on academic speech. That's a recurring theme in our universities. It's not just this. It says more about our universities than it does about Russia, the way things are at the moment.
And dare I say, as a journalist, I worry a lot more about...
But in terms of a boycott and a revulsion, I would not buy tickets for this. I wouldn't buy... If people want to say that and they feel that, that's absolutely fine.
No, I guess what I'm saying is there is a difference between Putin and Putin's regime and oligarchs, and then your everyday Russian citizen
Well, there is a difference
who hasn't done anything.
There is, but, well, that isn't entirely true, because although Russia is not a free democracy, it does have sorts of elections. There's no reason to think Putin hasn't actually got majority support in the country, and it appears that there is, from the minimal opinion polls that have been done, that there's a very large amount of public support for the war, whether they've been done so on the basis of flawed information or whatever.
You saw that at that event today. You saw that.
There is a lot of support. So the idea that the Russian people are somehow totally innocent, I'm not saying they need to be punished, but I don't think we should be supplying them.
We should be careful about spreading collective guilt as well.
It's not a matter of collective guilt.
What about, for example, like in America, they've been throwing rocks at Russian restaurants, and I can give you loads of examples.
Yeah, violent activities shouldn't take place. But deciding not to go to a Russian restaurant, why not?
That's perfectly all right. But when you have intimidation,
or the
implication of intimidation in the air, and I think that there is a lot of that, I think we as a civilized side of the war are obliged to respect the fundamental notions and norms of democracy and of freedom of exchange and freedom of expression. And I am worried that this happens in wars. I saw the first time that we become caricatures of ourselves, and instead of maintaining the moral high ground by saying that we're open to discuss ideas, we're going to argue and debate, there's a sense in which there's a closing down of discussion. And I think, as Michel says, you do have to begin to watch your words. So, for example, like I think that there are two sides to the argument in terms of its historical origin of this war. I think both sides made a lot of bad mistakes. There's no two sides in the discussion now. You have to support Ukraine against Russia. But to say that and to argue that that the West, is in some shape or form have contributed to a chain of events which led to this war. If you say that, then people think you're Dracula sometimes. Then you see people coming with a cross.
But that's not healthy.
Exactly.
I actually think not only is it not healthy, I actually think it's quite dangerous.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely.
Nabila, what was you about to say?
But I think we should differentiate between legitimate and indeed civilized way of acting, as Frank was highlighting, in terms of economic sanctions, boycotts, and all sorts of leverages that we have at our disposal to try and cripple a country that has illegally invaded a sovereign nation. Let's not lose sight of that. There lies the crime. But in terms of what I worry about is in terms of information, or indeed the amount of disinformation that we're getting, and not least of all, to go back to the point I was trying to make earlier, I do get worried when I see commentators trying to make out that Russia is on the verge of collapse, for example. And this is not my opinion. These are just cold facts about the huge industrial military complex in Russia. And I think it's reckless. It's a reckless view, and one that can potentially put the Ukrainians in a very dangerous position.
Yeah, and also there's been a lot of conversation around all the Brits that have opened up their homes to Ukrainian refugees, which I think is absolutely wonderful. I think it's really heartwarming, actually, to see that people have seen people in need and kind of stepped up, opened their home, or offered their home at this stage. Let's be clear where we are, but offered their home, etc. And I am a bit like a stuck record on this topic as well. I think that's great, and I think absolutely people should be doing that. Wonderful. But I do also think there are so many other conflicts happening in this world at the moment. There are so many, abuses of human rights being conducted by different foreign governments at this moment in time. And I do, after all this is done, hopefully it's sooner the better, I really hope, actually, that the sentiment that people have about wanting to help others, that we extrapolate that and help people in this country as well, because we have so many homeless people, we have so many children in care in this country, we have so many, women and children in this country that need to get out of abusive relationships, that aren't able to get into domestic violence refugees because of lack of funding and all the rest of it. And I hope that this kind of wanting to help sentiment continues and people actually want to help people here as well that really are in need all the time. And my last point, I find it peculiar, and I don't know why I'm looking at you, Daniel, but maybe just because you're sitting there. I find it peculiar when we've just been looking then at David Cameron. Here I am doing my kind of aid stuff, and I worry that we're kind of verging off into leveraging this crisis into opportunities for people to gain virtue points for themselves. Do you know what I'm saying? Do you get me? Does anyone on this panel agree with me?
Yeah,
Am I talking nonsense?
I get you. I don't entirely agree with you. I think the situation in Ukraine is specific to Ukraine. And the word refugees is used in a very broad sense, but there are different types of refugees. And what the people coming from Ukraine are better described as temporarily displaced persons, displaced by the horrors of war. They're not trying to leave the Ukraine in order to make a better life elsewhere. What they want is to get back to their home, and very often their families, their husbands, their fathers, in Ukraine as soon as they possibly can. That's a very different situation from refugees who are long-term refugees or people who are seeking a different life elsewhere. You're right, I think, about the points about people in, domestic abuse and people here in this country and what we can do for them. But I think we need to be more nuanced about what a refugee actually is, what it counts as. The UN High Commission for Refugees makes that distinction between temporarily displaced people
what the
and
Polish people
long-term
say,
refugees.
But when Ukrainians come in, there is a difference. The old refugees were single men who were economically motivated to move into Europe. These are women and children principally. There's hardly any men coming through, and they are genuine refugees. So I think they are specific. But there's a second point for Britain, which is that for the first time we have a refugee crisis that's linked to a threat to our own security. So in Ukraine, unlike in other places, our own security and that of Europe is entirely linked to it. And we should take that very seriously.
I need to move on, but Nabila, I want a final word to you, because I can see you shaking your head.
Yes, I think, what you've said is quite right. I mean, beyond all the logistical problems that the new government scheme for welcoming refugees will present, I think it's a huge, dare I say, let me first say that since the government officially opened its website to welcome refugees and allow British families to welcome refugees in their home, more than 138,000 Britons registered their interest in hosting a Ukrainian family. So I think these figures are huge testament to the generosity of the British people and the way their willingness to help people. And but it's not as simple as that. You have lots of very real logistical problems. The government itself is being extremely cautious, and things are more complex than they look. These are people who will have suffered physically and mentally. They wouldn't know what the future holds for them, and they won't just be able to slip quietly into British life. I think a lot of them won't be willing to just sit there. They would quite rightly want to get jobs, even if it's on a temporary basis, before thinking of going back home. And there will be all sorts of checks that will need to be carried out, insurances arranged, and resources allocated and the like. And beyond all these logistical problems, remember that Britain has just gone through a very long and complex process which was meant to prioritise British citizens over new arrivals. And these new measures put in place by the government in the wake of Brexit were meant to make it harder for new arrivals and not easier. But you also highlighted the problem
briefly, if you will.
Briefly about, there are other people, new arrivals from other war-torn nations, not least of all Afghanistan, who will argue that their needs are just as important as those of the Ukrainians. And dare I say, it has to be said that the truth is that dark-skinned Muslim migrants are treated with far more suspicion and, dare I say, antagonism than people from European nations.
Okay. I do have to clarify, I wasn't talking about arrivals or definitions of refugees. The point I was trying to make is it's wonderful that people have stepped up to help people in need from different countries. That's excellent. The point I was trying to highlight is that there are thousands of people in this country, actually, that could do with some help and support from their fellow citizens. Anyway, let's go to a quick break. When I come back, I want to talk to you about COVID, and I want to talk to you about the DVLA, and I also want to give you some good news as well to send you off into your weekend. I'll see you in a couple of minutes. Hello there, welcome back to Dewbs Co with me, Michelle Dewberry. Just a quick reminder as to who our panel is keeping me company tonight. We've got Daniel Moylan, who's the former advisor to Boris Johnson and now a Conservative life peer in the House of Lords. Nabila Ramdani, who's a journalist and broadcaster, and Frank Furedi, who's the author and academic. Now, let's talk COVID, shall we? All remaining COVID travel measures, including the passenger locator form and tests for unvaccinated arrivals, have now ended in the UK. I've got to press pause there just purely so that I can go, yes! Anyway, back to my professional self. The Department of Transport has said a range of contingency measures will be kept in reserve in case action is needed to tackle new variants. Previously, only fully vaccinated people were able to enter the UK without the need for tests. The decision was made despite rising COVID-19 cases in the UK, which have risen by nearly 44% in the last week. That's according to ONS data. Daniel Moylan, your thoughts?
It's great news. I'm with you. It's fantastic news. It's great that we're leading the world in this, and we've got to learn to live with COVID. We can't carry on the way we have been in the past, fearful and restricted, and we've got to go out and embrace the world.
But what would you just say to the point I just made then, when it's, hang on a second, because cases are rising in some places? Are you not nervous?
No, I'm not nervous. I think we've got vaccines. We've got to live with it. We've got to be sensible and cautious in how we conduct ourselves. That's absolutely fine, and we need to go on. We cannot live cowering under our chairs for months and months on end. We have to be brave and go forward and embrace the world as we find it.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to say, Frank, I agree with everything Daniel's just said then, but I also believe that there's still people that have lost their mind over COVID. The whole response and reaction to COVID, I hope, anyway, I might be wrong, but I hope that in years to come, we'll look back and go, goodness me, what on earth were we thinking? Putting in place some of the restrictions, the measures, etc.
Well, I think what we have now is a group of people who've adopted this lockdown lifestyle, whereby they basically live the lockdown forever. I went skiing last week, and I thought it was very, very interesting that half the people on the plane absolutely resented wearing a mask. Mm-hmm. The other half loved it. And when we go down to Grenoble to the airport...
How do you know, by the way? How do you know that?
Well, you could just tell. They were looking at the other half as if they were moral inferiors. And when my wife asked one of them, sort of, why are you wearing the mask now that we're, outside of the airport, because we're waiting for the buses? One of them says, well, we could never be too careful, and the hint was that somehow we're irresponsible for using our bare faces to engage with the world. And I think that's because there's a lot of statistics that show that almost a third of the population really thinks that we're going too fast in terms of getting rid of COVID restrictions. And there's a syndrome that psychologists invented called the cave syndrome.
Called the what? Cave
syndrome.
Cave syndrome.
Which basically is about the fear of re-entering into the world and leaving your cave behind, which indicates that for a lot of people, this kind of lifestyle is going to be around for a fair bit of time. And I think that's very sad. It's very regrettable that not everybody is celebrating and enthusing about the fact that, we're back to a semblance of normality.
Nabila, I mean, there's a place in China that's just gone back into lockdown. There's talks about goings on in places like Hong Kong, and there's still a desire in some places to get to zero COVID, to literally try and eliminate COVID from the menu, if you excuse my crassness. But it's just not possible in my mind anyway. And we do just have to get on. What do you think about what Frank was just saying then, again, about the whole kind of cave syndrome and people that have been, they've adjusted now to this new normal?
Yes, absolutely, and that's why one of the government's announcements towards the end of the year was to say that we have to learn to live with it. Britain has been one of, or the first country, I think, to move from the status of pandemic to endemic, meaning that the COVID-19 will be, or the virus will be part and parcel of our lives from now on. But, with vaccination rollouts showing that they were quite effective in containing or indeed making the virus less life-threatening, if I may say so. We see less cases of people dying, for example. So that should be welcome news. But I think, as you quite rightly said, one of the aspects of all this has been to learn that we can lose our freedoms fairly quickly, and we shouldn't take anything for granted in that respect. And beyond the cost of dealing with all this, I think the sheer amount of stress and hassle and indeed all the paperwork involved has been an absolute nightmare for most of us. And the last couple of years have been particularly miserable for all travellers in particular, whether going on business trips or indeed on holiday. So I think this is fantastic news as far as I'm concerned, and especially as the Easter holidays are nearing.
I've got to say, it's not been miserable for me when it comes to travelling, because I've decided not to travel abroad purely because I would be on the side of the plane that you would describe, and I would not be on the side of the plane that was loving it. I would become infuriated with all the red tape and all the rest of it. So I just decided I'm not doing it. I will do a staycation. I'd just stay in the UK. I'd go just places here. If it continued, I would have just, unfortunately for my son, I would have been taking him camping and those kind of things. I just would have refused to travel if this had carried on. But there are still people that are frightened. And actually, if I try and put myself in the mindset, because we're all kind of sitting on this panel saying that it's wonderful, but Daniel, I'll come back to you. If you put yourself in the mindset of someone who's got a very compromised immune system, that is actually at risk of harm from COVID and is vulnerable, and it probably would be frightening, I suspect, to go
certainly.
live.
If you have a compromised immune system and you're seriously ill, you're at risk not just from COVID, but from a whole range of other infections, and you have to conduct your life very carefully and very differently in order to stay safe. And this is not just a COVID thing. But I don't think it's people like that Frank was talking about, who were sitting on the airplane to Grenoble to go skiing. Okay, the people on the airplane going skiing, I mean, I never skied in my life. It's far too strenuous. But I mean, presumably you need to be reasonably fit to go skiing. Your limbs have to work. Your muscles have to be in reasonably good shape. These people are presumably fundamentally healthy, or they wouldn't be going off to the slopes.
Well, not really, because a lot of people go skiing just for the après skis. They've got no intention of going
then you're telling me things I don't even know about.
Après skiing.
I mean, the après is really serious stuff. So
it's wonderful. That's the best part.
It's not for half-hearted. But I think there's a bigger problem, which is in schools, in universities, in the civil service, there's a substantial number of people that refuse to go back to work even now. So many teachers, for example, and headmasters have decided to ignore the rules about masks because they argue that you can never be safe enough. In my university and other universities, we're still not back to normal face-to-face teaching. In the civil service, some section of the civil service, literally about 40% of the employees still have not returned to the office. So when you have that kind of attitude throughout the country, we have to realize that COVID had a huge psychological, emotional impact, which basically validates the laziness of some people, but also the genuine fear of others.
And by the way, when you talk about masks, there might be viewers in Scotland that would be sitting there going, this is all well and good what you're talking about, but in Scotland, some of these rules are persisting. It's not been the end of masks and things like that. And I just kind of, I always have to try and pick my words carefully in this because I have incredibly strong opinions about all of this stuff, I have to tell you. But when it comes to Scotland, Nabila, I think, I'll just say it as I think it, but I just think that people have got this COVID thing and they've become power crazed. They see this as this kind of opportunity to almost, this is my moment, this is my opportunity to differentiate myself from England, to control my population. And I think it's all gone to their heads a little bit. I'm talking about Nicola Sturgeon, obviously.
Well, you might get Scots who will have the exact same reverse view about England, saying this is a power trip by Boris Johnson, granting individual freedoms while being a bit reckless. But I think it's about finding the right balance and trying to take into account the health issues extremely seriously, while also making sure that the country reopens economically and functions as normal as much as possible. And I think people are quite happy in general to go back to work, to go back to some sort of normalcy, in the knowing that they are going to be safe generally. So it's a difficult one, but I think it's about striking the right balance.
Well, you say that some people are happy to go back to work, etc. I've got to say, I still think there's an awful lot of companies that use COVID as an excuse to provide diabolical service. I cannot believe how many companies, I won't name them because I don't want to get sued, quite frankly, but there are so many companies now that you still cannot even barely get through to somebody because of COVID, because they're experiencing all of these long wait times, etc. No, you're not. You're just cutting corners because of COVID and you're using it as an excuse to provide poor service. That's what you're doing. It doesn't wash with me, I'm afraid. Anyway, we're going to take a quick break. When I come back, I want to talk to you, actually, speaking of which, about the DVLA, what's been going on there. Have you been waiting for your licence? There's been big backlogs. We'll be looking at what's been going on. Get in touch with me if you've been affected. gbviews@gbnews.uk. When we come back, I'll be reading out some of your comments on the stories, and I'm going to end the show tonight with a bit of good news for a change. Hello there, welcome back to Dewbs Co with me, Michelle Dewberry. A reminder as to my panel, Daniel Moylan, who's the former advisor to Boris Johnson and now Conservative life peer in the House of Lords, Nabila Ramdani, who's a journalist and broadcaster, and Frank Furedi, who's the author and academic. Now let's talk DVLA, shall we, briefly? It's emerged that hundreds of DVLA staff were sent home on full pay during the pandemic without having to work at all. Over half of the government's agency staff were at home doing not a lot / nothing during the first lockdown in April and May 2020, including those that were not ill with COVID. And figures for August 2020 reveal that nearly 1,000 DVLA workers remained on special paid leave. This decision to let staff be paid for doing nothing for weeks has left millions of motorists stuck in a backlog of licence applications and renewals. I've got to say, I don't think I made myself clear enough. I'm not sure I repeated the sentence enough during that intro. So just to highlight, in case I wasn't clear, these people were doing nothing.
Yes.
Have I landed my point? Nothing. This special paid leave, this basically applied to people that said that they were vulnerable or that they needed to care for people or whatever. They were just off on full pay. While motorists, and cast your mind back, by the way, because we've moved on from this in the media, but let's not forget, we had a massive HGV shortage. We was apparently going to have empty shelves and never be eating anything ever again because we didn't have drivers, etc. Nabila, your thoughts?
Well, these are the results of a detailed investigations by the Times, and the results do not surprise me at all. I mean, if you send thousands of civil servants on full pay, you send them home on full pay during a global pandemic, it's quite obvious that many of them are not going to do much work. And it has to be said that most of the administrative work carried out by agencies such as DVLA is by definition very dull and, dare I say, very repetitive. So unsupervised workers who are sitting at home are naturally going to be drawn to more, let's say, attractive pursuits. And in the case of the Times investigations, this included watching a lot of television. So it wasn't just a question of staff not working, but there just wasn't enough work being generated because there was nobody in the office to handle incoming mail, for example. So it just goes to show that, you know, packed workplaces are essential to the smooth running of bureaucracy, and the sooner everybody gets back at work properly, the better, I think.
And Daniel, you know, Nabila mentions packed workforces, and this was one of the problems that the unions had, actually, because they were very insistent on very special measures being taken in the offices of the DVLA that meant that actually people were not able to be in the office in the numbers that they should have been, I would suggest. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I normally like to stick up for the government. I really would like to know when the government found out about this. I mean, did they read it in the Times as well? How long have they known about this, and what have they been doing about it? Because, you know, we're well on from this now, and if there's still a backlog of 1 million, who's been dealing with it? Second question is, this was not in line with government guidance. I don't know what the unions dictated, but the government guidance was you should work from home if you could. And if it was the case that they couldn't work from home, lots of people had computer terminals at home where they could actually work and plug into central systems and carry on working. If that wasn't possible for the DVLA because of the way they work, and I don't understand that, they should have been going into the office, and the union should have been face down over this, because people were able, lots of people went into offices were well organised so that people could work in them, socially distanced, as they said, and that should have been the driving thing behind the management of the DVLA. It does look to me like the management just gave up. Did the government know at the time? When did they discover? Who's responsible for all this, and who's carrying the can?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you who always carries the can, as per usual. It's us, your everyday person. So there'll be many of you that's been desperately waiting for your licence and haven't got it. There's a backlog, by the way, of nearly 1 million. And I know that many of you often have to send off your passports and things like that. And you will have had, well, Frank, you tell me what you think, actually. I keep telling everyone what I think, and you wonderful people are here too.
I think what I learned from all this experience is that government guidance is not worth the paper it's written on. And in so many cases, despite government guidance, you know, people just carry on in the same old kind of way. And the problem is not the workers at DVLA, the problem is management. Because I think what you got is a very slothful management that finds management a bit of a drag. You know, they would rather sort of stay in their digital bedrooms, you know, sort of and mess around than actually give leadership. And we're finding this happening in so many government-related departments in the public sector that it's becoming truly frightening. I mean, it even extends to the Foreign Office, where something like a third of the members of the Foreign Office who work there are still staying in you know, at home. So for me, the real problem is that we need a much more genuine leadership in these areas, where people actually lead from the front. I think to me, the biggest tragedy or the biggest problem that this brings about isn't just simply the fact you can't get your license, it's the fact that the government is not in control of its own state. I think what we're learning more and more, there's numerous examples of the last year, is that the government imagines that they're sort of implementing policy, but somewhere along the line, that policy implementation or that direction, those directives, get diffused and become completely irrelevant, and the whole kind of machinery just carries on in a very sort of passive kind of a way, which I think represents, you know, not just not value for money. I think it represents the, you know, in some ways giving 2 fingers to the taxpayer, because it's our money that's being wasted, and it's the taxpayer who's not being serviced with some very essential services.
Well, lots of you have been getting in touch, actually, letting me know that you've struggled with this as well. Phil says that he had a nightmare at the DVLA for over a year, trying to get his licence renewed on medical grounds. Carol says it's diabolical. She references how difficult it is as well to get through on the telephone. Lots of you have been getting in touch, I have to say, on the whole kind of Russian-Ukrainian situation. It always really does divide opinions. And Dave makes a really interesting point. He says, our government's first responsibility is to the British people. He asked a question, shouldn't we be suspending foreign aid right now? And that, Dave, if I say so, is quite a good question and a debate for another day. Should we still be paying foreign aid? Should we be paying it in the way that we used to? And by the way, where are we getting all this money from at the moment? I thought that we, barely had any money not that long ago. Now, it seems that any time there's a problem, millions, hundreds of millions come out of God only knows where. Anyway, it's Friday, which means it's the weekend, and that means that I want to leave you with some good news to go into the weekend, because we barely have any of that these days. So let me share with you this story that caught my eye. You might have seen some of it. There's two young brothers. They were lost in the Amazon jungle for 26 days, nearly 4 weeks. You might have seen this story in the news. And if you have, like I said, nearly 4 weeks they've been missing, guess what? They've been found. They were found by a local tree cutter, alive, and they have been rescued. I'm showing you on the screen what they what they looked like before they went missing. And this is the condition they were found in. If I've got these pictures, they are quite concerning. Look at that. These two beautiful little boys, aged 7 and 9, they were found with severe malnutrition, dehydration and skin abrasions, and they will remain in hospital until they gain weight. But I have to say, what a lovely end to that story. Whenever you see, children going missing, I'm playing the rescue right now. I mean, look at this. You can see such a big crowd has gathered. As a mum to a little boy myself, I've got to say those pictures when they were found, it makes me get goosebumps. Thank God, whoever your God is that you pray to, I mean, look at it, there they are, beautiful, beautiful little boys, and thank the Lord that they are found safe and well. So happy news to end the show. That's all we've got time for tonight. Thank you very much to my panel, Frank, Nabila and Daniel. Thank you very much to you at home as well. Never lose the faith. That's the motto. That's the message I got from that story. 4 weeks missing and found safe and well. You have yourselves a good weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.